Here, Griffith.
To Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with permission, I will answer questions 2 and 12 on the order paper together. On the 5th of September, I announced Fiona Woolf as the chair of the inquiry. Ben Emerson QC was announced as counsel to the inquiry, and Graham Wilmer and Barbara Hearn were announced as panel members. The remaining panel members and the terms of reference will be announced shortly. It is important that we get this right to ensure this inquiry is able to challenge individuals and institutions, get to the bottom of these abhorrent crimes, and ensure that they will not happen again.
Here, Griffith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, the number of people barred from working with children has fallen from 11,000 in 2011 to 2,660 in 2013, which means that people convicted of serious offences against children are no longer automatically barred from working with children. So will the Home Secretary look into whether the inquiry will examine this issue together with looking into current child protection practices?
The purpose of the inquiry was set up in recognition of the number of cases, both historical and increasingly, as we've seen recently, ongoing, that have been taking place, which have suggested significant failings and problems in certain institutional and other environments where people have frankly not been abiding by their duty of care to children. What the inquiry is going to do is to look into those circumstances, to tell us what we need to do in the future to ensure that institutional and state institutional and non-state institutional environments do maintain their duty of care to children, so we don't see these horrific crimes being committed in the future.
Dr. Roberta Blackman-Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Home Secretary explain why the inquiries will not look at the outcome of the forthcoming serious case reviews or the impact of cuts in local authority children's services, especially as the severity of cuts in some areas will make it impossible for local authorities to take on board the inquiry's recommendations when they eventually come?
The Honourable Lady will see when the terms of reference of the inquiry are published the nature of the work that it is going to do. But as I have just explained in response to the question from her honourable friend, the inquiry was set up against the background of the concern of the number of historic cases that we have seen of sexual abuse of children and sexual exploitation. We have subsequently seen a number of other cases coming forward which show that sadly this is not simply a crime that has occurred in the past, but it is occurring in the present. And it is necessary to make sure that institutions are abiding by their duty of care to children. It will be identifying what the faults were, what happened in relation to those particular institutional environments, and what lessons need to be learned from that.
Mr. Michael Ellis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Communications data is vital in child abuse cases and in other serious cases. In her speech recently, the Home Secretary said that in a 6-month period, the NCA had to drop at least 20 cases in which a child was judged to be at risk of imminent harm. And the Met have also had to drop 12 cases within a 3-month period. Yet the Deputy Prime Minister has said, meanwhile, that the only issue that needs resolution is the availability of unique IP addresses. Can the Home Secretary say whether that's correct?
My honourable friend raises an important point in relation to communications data, and of course he sat on the joint parliamentary committee that scrutinised the draft Data Communications Bill, and that cross-party committee accepted that there was a need for legislation to improve our ability to access communications data. He mentions the cases that I have recently quoted. Among them are cases that were not just about IP addresses, but about our inability to obtain communications data because communications service providers based overseas do not retain the right data. Of the NCA cases I mentioned, 2 were discontinued because of this problem. One of those 2 was a case involving the distribution of indecent images of children. Of the Met cases, my honourable friend mentioned a number. 6 were discontinued because of the lack of retained data. Of those 6 cases, 1 involved posting indecent images and 1 related to child protection, in which there was a threat to life, and 1 was a kidnap where there was a threat to life. And this is the problem that the Communications Data Bill would have addressed. So while we are taking action to address the problem caused by IP addresses, it's not true that the cases I mentioned in my speech were related simply to IP addresses. And even for those cases discontinued because of the lack of a unique IP address, it doesn't mean that if there was such a unique IP address, the case could have been continued, because the scale of the problem means that there will probably be no communications data available for that IP address anyway. So I say across this House and to our coalition colleagues, if they're serious about giving the police the capabilities they need to keep us safe, protect children and save lives, they reconsider their position on the communications tape.
We are all now better informed, but at somewhat of a cost, and I'm keen to accommodate the interests of backbenchers, to which interest I know the Home Secretary will be profoundly sympathetic. Mr. Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the terms of reference are published, should they be as wide as possible? And secondly, the Home Secretary will know that I've pushed for some time to try and increase the tariffs of those that abuse children and are involved in paedophilia.
I thank my honourable friend, and we are aiming to ensure that the terms of reference are able to cover everything that they need to cover. But I'm sure that all members of this House will recognise that we want this not to be an inquiry that just goes on ad infinitum. Should the terms of reference be too wide, we need to have resolution of these issues, we need to identify the problems and to be able to deal with them, and I note the point that is made. I know he has championed that particular cause for some time.
Mr. Ian Paisley.
Speaker, will the Secretary of State listen to the innocent voices of the victims of the Kincora Boys' Home, where children were abused systematically there in Belfast? Will that be included in this national investigation, as is their desire?
I say to the honourable gentleman that I have received representations in relation to the issue of the Kincora inquiry, and of course Sir Anthony Hart is undertaking an inquiry. I am looking at the moment about the best means of ensuring that the most thorough possible investigation and inquiry has taken place into the events of Kincora. I have not yet come to a decision as to whether that would be to bring it within this inquiry or to make it possible for it to happen within the Kincora inquiry in Northern Ireland. But the aim of us all is the same, that we make sure that that issue is investigated thoroughly and all the elements that need to be addressed are addressed.
Julian Hubbard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Home Secretary will be aware of the failure of CEOP in the Project Spade case, where 2,500 names that passed from Canadian police of people buying child abuse images were not looked at. There is a doctor in Cambridge at Addenbrooke's Hospital who was abusing children who was on that list. Had CEOP acted with the powers they already had, a number of children would not have been abused. What does the Home Secretary have to say to those children about the failure of the police under her watch?
I have to say to my honourable friend that he's absolutely right to raise a level of concern about the action that was taken in relation to Project Spade and the information that was received from the Toronto Police by CEOP. This is a matter that the NCA have referred to the IPCC, and they are looking into this issue, and obviously I'm sure he, like I, will await with interest the outcome of their inquiry.
Diana Johnson.
Speaker, now the NCA know of 20,000 people they think are accessing online child abuse, but they lack the resources to follow that up. And many police forces also have a huge backlog, according to the NSPCC. And the Honourable Member for Cambridge just referred to the case of the Cambridge doctor, who was also a deputy head, who had 15 months more in the classroom before conviction because information was not passed on. Now, we currently have separate lists of people suspected of posing a risk to children and of those working closely with children. So can the Home Secretary explain why these lists are not being cross-checked and why last year the police only referred 108 cases to the Disclosure and Barring Service of people who they were concerned about?
The Honourable Lady quotes a number of figures in her question, and it is right that a significant number of people have been identified as accessing these child abuse images. I think it is true to say, and I have made this point more generally in the past, but I think it is true to say that we are not yet fully aware of the full scope of the nature of the problem of this issue of child abuse in terms of people accessing images, or indeed of child abuse that takes place. And the implications of that. The National Crime Agency have recently made a significant number of arrests, obviously in relation to Operation Notarise, of individuals, and they do operate on a very clear basis of ensuring that they are dealing firstly, for those cases where they consider that there is particular harm to children arising. I think it's right that they should prioritise in that way, but this is an issue that I think is wider than the sort of figures that she has suggested and wider than the response from the National Crime Agency.
Ellen Jones.
Theresa.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, as its first opportunity,